so much spontaneity gets trained out of us, I think, at the beginning in our classical education.
We're afraid we're going to make a mistake. That somehow that mistake is going to be a reflection of who we are as a human being.
Yeah. You know, you're studying your Bach, and there are all these notes that have squiggles over them. And it is vitally important that you play that squiggle differently than that squiggle. And you spend many, many hours with your teacher on the details of the squiggles, right?
Right.
What does that do to you? So you're here at the Juilliard School for a week or so working with the students.
Right.
And I'm very aware that when we are working with students these days, one of the things that we're talking about quite a lot is versatility, flexibility, you know, what it means to be a musician in a very different way, frankly, than the way we were trained, which was so narrow. But you have had this extremely flexible, you know, multi-layered, multi-dimensional career for a long time. And I wanted to ask you if that was your vision going in, or if that's just something that happened along the way.
I think it happened. I think I think about some of my old friends, one of whom is actually on the faculty here at Juilliard, Billy Drummond, the great jazz drummer. When we were growing up, I was the classical guy in my band of guys that I hung out with. Those guys were all jazzers, but we all loved music, and we loved sharing music with each other. And so I was playing Shostakovich and Beethoven and Brahms for those guys on the weekends, and they were playing Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Dexter Gordon for me. And today, we're all working, which is amazing. But the other thing is that we feel very comfortable in other genre because we grew up experiencing each other's genre. I often like to joke and say those guys taught me what a groove was. But, you know, I landed where I landed, and it just turned out that I was just equally comfortable in all those places that I landed.
Yeah, and it's more fun.
It's a it's totally more fun. I like it that no 2 weeks are ever the same, or rarely are 2 weeks ever the same. I mean, I could be doing film music one place, and then Shostakovich or Mahler, and then another place, and then teaching in another place, which takes a whole different set of muscles, by the way.
For sure. That's where you do have to sort of shift your mindset. Yeah. But I remember when we worked together at the Indianapolis Symphony last spring, you were coming from something wildly different. I don't remember what it was. It was a big jazz pops show. But, I mean, overnight you shifted to Dvorak and Price.
Right.
And it was interesting to watch you do that.
Yeah, but it's easy for me to do that. I mean, here's why it's easy. Because music is just music. Yeah. And we're talking about expression. Yeah. And we're talking about your blood and soil and whatever that is being poured into whatever it is that you do. You know, it's funny because the program that I'm doing here includes the Third Symphony of Florence Price.
Oh, nice.
And the first rehearsal, the kids were, I mean, they're at Juilliard. They're classically trained, right? And they're like serious and, you know, focused. And they had never met me before, and I had never met them. And so I guess one of the things that they wanted to prove was the fact that they could play. Yeah. And so ultimately, by the time we get to the break in rehearsal, I have convinced them that I care more about their hearts than their heads. Yeah. And we started talking about, in fact, I taught them this one expression because you have to have it with this music. I said, here's something that you need to learn how to say. How do you spell that? I don't know. Yeah. But you gotta have a sense of, and I explained what that means when you're in the midst of a challenge that you don't think you can overcome. But right now, all you can just go is and then how that has to translate into that particular clarinet moment.
Oh, I love that.
And that's not on the page, right? But so that's my heart being poured out to them, and their hearts answering in return.
So we were in rehearsal for the Price Concerto, and there was this gesture in the slow movement that you were not getting from the orchestra the way you wanted to. Mm-hmm. And you started telling this story. And it was kind of a long story, and I was like, it was a great story. It was about your childhood, And being at your
grandmother.
grandmother's house and listening to her praying in the bathroom and her saying, Lord have mercy. And you were trying to get them to hear that inflection and that phrase, and then they played exactly the way you wanted to. And I realized, you were going out of your way not to say, oh, it's like a prayer or it's like a spiritual. You needed them to have a picture and a sound. And that was
Right.
that was really enlightening to
It
me.
needed to be visceral for them
Yes.
as well, and that required more than just a description.
Yeah.
When I have an orchestra, I want there to be people in the orchestra who are willing to jump off a cliff with me. But I also want people in the orchestra who's old enough and wise enough to know that sometimes it's dangerous to jump off of a cliff, right? And so if you have that combination of risk takers and risk averse, you can do some dangerous things,
That's so interesting.
and get away with it.
Yeah. That experience with you, it made me think about something. I'm advocating passionately for this music. And really, we are in a moment of excavating the history of American music and recovering all these voices of Black composers that have been historically overlooked. And it's very, very important. And it's happened kind of quickly and sometimes carelessly. But I realize that this process has all these implications, right, about history and America and racism, and all of those things get put on this music. But are we teaching this music? Because the whole point is, it is a different language. That was intentional. These composers were innovating and creating a musical language, and I'm not sure that we're actually teaching it. And it's made me think about my responsibility, not just to play this music, but actually to teach it, and not to be afraid to confront the fact that people don't know how to play it.
I didn't even know who Samuel Coleridge Taylor was until I got out of graduate school. As a conductor, conductor of my hue, we would always say that we were like always really busy in February, and then one day in January, what I call Negro Night at the Symphony. Yeah. I often also say that I didn't know that I liked beats until I was a grown-up. And the reason that I didn't know I didn't like beats is because, the reason that I didn't know that I liked beats was because nobody fed me those beats when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And so this new repertoire that we're trying to add to the canon, had it been included, there would have been a learned history that was brought to the 21st century of that as well. The other thing is, when I finally encountered this music, I was slightly embarrassed by it because I was trained in another language. And then at some point, there wasn't like a bell went off or a switch clicked or something like that, but I realized how important it was to be comfortable in my own skin. Because I realized that those composers, what they were doing was actually being comfortable in their own skin.
Oh, yeah.
And then I thought, wait, you know who else was comfortable in their own skin? Mahler and Dvorak. Mahler never apologized for being Jewish in his music, and nor did Dvorak ever apologize for loving his home country.
Right.
And for some reason, we expected Black folks or women to assimilate into somebody else's voice when nobody else had to do that before.
Right.
I had a radio announcement. A radio guy said to me one time before interview before a concert. He says, "Wow, every composer on this program is Black." I went, "And your point?"
Yeah.
Because hasn't there been many years where every composer was white, right? I mean,
Of course.
It's just all new, and everybody's trying to play catch up. But you are exactly right. We have to make the case for this music, and part of making the case is the why are we doing this, and what is this, and why it belongs. Only because it's the only thing that's going to help the uninitiated realize what this sound world is.
That's right. I realized when I went back to Gershwin, to Rhapsody in Blue over this last month, I come to it now with a completely different understanding of what Gershwin was doing, of what that time was, because I know now the composers and the musicians that he was hearing in his time. This stuff wasn't floating around in the air. He was learning from, exactly these composers, these artists.
They all listen to each other.
Yeah.
I mean, they all know. They kind of know what's going on. There's a line from a play. The play is, "Do black patent leather shoes really reflect up?" And the line is, the character says, "Oh, to be black and a woman, it's so redundant." And that's almost what Florence Price said when she was actually trying to make, in fact, she did say it. Because I have two things going against me.
To realize, I guess, how close we are to this history, like it's still tangible, but we had no connection with it. So, I mean, I'm just grateful that we get to build it now. And, here you are at this institution, and it is different for these kids.
But here's the cool part. They get it.
Yeah.
But they have to be given it.
Yes.
And I said, it's only going to broaden their ability to make music going forward. That's not canned and, prescribed. Spontaneity, I think is what it is. That's a heck of a lot more fun than just it being the exact same thing every single time.
Yes. It's really so different to say this phrase has to sound like, an intake of breath or something. This music that we're talking about, I think it is full of human impulses. And we're not saying you have to do it this way because we've always done it this way.
Right.
We're saying you should do it this way because this is what it's trying to evoke. This is where it's coming from. And I think that's such a healthy place in music making and in the learning of music making. It lets us just inhabit our music in a different way.
Yeah, we're doing American in Paris. And there's this little duet of violins. So I took a half of a tissue in rehearsal and threw it up in the air. And it just floated down to the bottom. And I said, that's what that is.
I just want to go to all your rehearsals.
Those notes aren't manufactured. Those notes are just falling out of the sky, right?
Yeah.
And you're just discovering them. Yes, I've had professional players say that they love it when they're given something else to think about other than how to just execute it.
Right.
Because then they can, especially the pros, if you say, listen, that should float more, that means something else to them. That means something to them. They know physically how to make that thing float.
Yeah.
Without saying, okay, don't put so much pressure on the bow. Here, I got to say, don't put so much pressure on the bow because we want this thing to float.
Yeah.
That's the thing about teaching.
Yeah.
You use a whole lot more words, right?
Yes. Yeah. Painting pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you learn from your students?
Well, a couple things. One is I learned that you can never underestimate their intelligence or overestimate their ignorance. I learned that they actually do have something to offer. I learned that I often say that my teaching is less about instruction and more about invitation. I learned that, especially young music students, they want to be invited to something. But I've also learned that it's a generation that doesn't appreciate the world that we've handed them. Yeah. And in fact, I've often, a lot of places gone, if I'm in front of students, before the week is over, I offer my apology on behalf of my generation. And just a few weeks ago, I was talking to some young college students. I said, when I was a kid, the questions that we asked were, is there really a man on the moon? You're asking, will I actually survive the school day? That's just not fair. So I learned to have a much deeper respect for their humanity. That's what I get from them.
Well, we all should. And that in itself, I mean, that should always be the foundation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not that we are so superior to them as artists or as teachers or whatever. No, we've got to. I talk a lot sometimes, speaking of Dvorak or the Price that we did, that there's a difference between sympathy and empathy. Mm-hmm. Sympathy says, I pat you on the head and wish you good luck. Empathy says, I'm walking with you every step of this journey. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what our responsibility is to the younger generation.
Yeah. And also maybe if that's our focus, that's our priority, then we're not just teaching them lessons of the past, even though this is an old tradition and the history are important, but mm-hmm. we're teaching them from the beginning how to take this into the future.
Right. Yeah. I mean, listen, composers have never made it their life endeavor to show us how smart they were. They wanted to show us how music can be the thing that allows us to overcome, mm-hmm. in most instances.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so, I think one of the things that we're both talking about without actually saying it is that we want these students to walk out of the room with hearts of servants, mm-hmm. and understand that the purpose of this music is to make people better when they leave the building as opposed to when they entered. And if that's the case, then we have a requisite responsibility to find every possible avenue to getting at the essence of the music. The substance of the music is us. We dot the I's and cross the T's, but the essence of the music is way past those. Is that a dash or a dot kind of thing?
That's right.
Right. So, I think ultimately, I often said, if I can get a kid to fall in love, they'll practice. Mm-hmm. I don't have to hammer them about practicing because mm-hmm. they know, once they're in love, they know, I can't get back to that place if I don't get this doggone scale right.
Right.
Right. So,
right. But the motivation for that, I love how you just said that. That's one of the most beautiful things. And the motivation for that, when I think back to my training, the toxic part, the part that made me feel bad about everything, including myself, was you need to work hard so you will be best, mm-hmm. for no given reason. Mm-hmm. But that message, you work hard so you can give the best of yourself. Mm-hmm. That's very different.
Mm-hmm. Now, I did have a couple people that said to me, "You're not there yet, pal." That's a whole nother thing, right?
Sure.
So I mean, I know we don't want to discount the people who are like on you to make sure that you do learn how to dot those.
But that's part of giving you the best of yourself.
That's bingo, right?
Yeah.
That's called building a work ethic. I know that when my wife met my teacher from NEC, New England Conservatory, my wife met him for the first time and she goes, "You turned my husband into a workaholic." And he said, "Yep, because that's how it gets done." End of story.